Sometimes the past is too raw to confront, sometimes the significance fades or changes over time. And when the past is examined, well, it's always from the perspective of the present day. So, what is the meaning of the 75th anniversary commemoration of the liberation of the Auschwitz concentration camp? Remember, it wasn't mob rule or a burst of collective folly that brought the final solution, as the Nazis called it. It was a state bureaucracy devoted over years to the methodical extermination of millions of men, women, and children, the vast majority of them Jewish. Who was heroic or demonic, brave or cowardly? The argument still rages. The latest illustration, that spat we saw between Poland and Russia over the collective behavior of their respective nations during World War II. 75 years on, with identity politics now on the rise, how does the past truly inform the present and, dare we say it, the future? Today in the France 24 debate, we're remembering Auschwitz. Joining us, he was first a physicist, then a psychoanalyst, Izio Rosenman, a Polish-born Jew. On January the 27th, 1945, your own liberation was still 2.5 months away because you were at the Buchenwald concentration camp. You are the president of the Association for a Humanist and Secular Judaism. Thank you for joining us.
Right.
I want to thank as well Brian Schiff, director of the American University of Paris's George and Irina Schaefer Center for the Study of Genocide, Human Rights, and Conflict Prevention. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks.
And it's always a pleasure to welcome back from Brussels Dominika Czosic, correspondent for Polish state broadcaster TVP.
Hello.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and on Twitter. The hashtag is F24debate. Survivors from around the globe returned to Auschwitz and its sister camp Birkenau this Monday, all to remember the 1.1 million murdered by the Nazis.
Care for another human being didn't belong there. Human dignity didn't belong there. Quite the opposite. Even if you open a dictionary, you won't find a word to describe the way humanity was trampled on.
So those are hard words, Izio Rosenman. But in that same speech, she also talked about great moments of humanity, of humaneness that she experienced.
I think it's right. I was a child in Buchenwald, and what I want to say, it's impossible to survive, even in hell, if for a child at least, nobody can speak for all others, if you don't find help from other people. So personally, I found from time to time, help of other people. Otherwise, you cannot survive in a place where really most of people are your enemies, your potential enemies. And this is particularly true for a child because a child grows with a feeling, with a need that the adults will help him. If he finds himself in a place where the adults who are stronger than him, who knew better all the tricks you have to know, if they are his enemies, he cannot survive. So
who
he must find somebody, not every time the same people.
Who helped you?
Who helped me? First of all, I want to say shortly, in Buchenwald was a very special camp because it was originally created by Hitler for his political enemies. So in Buchenwald, you had a lot of communists, German communists. So they were really people devoted for the good. And we survived collectively, 1,000 people. We were 1,000 people because these people who were managing the inner life of the camp created a block for the children. So that was the first thing. In this block, we hadn't to go to work. And this winter was awful, really, -20 or -50. So it was impossible for children to survive in the same condition. So collectively, we had the help of these people. And also, from time to time, everybody of us had the help of another teammate. And I will even say a paradox, really. I had once the help of an SS. In the camp, the SS can come to you, hit you, and kill you. That happened for my uncle. He was killed by... He saw me and he said me, come with me. Come with me. I came with him. And he brought me to the brothel.
The brothel of the camp.
The brothel was a brothel. And there he asked that people will give me soup. So that's a really totally...
Why did he do it?
Irrational, paradoxically. But other times I had the help of inmate people. But this paradox, why? You know, this word was not a rational word. This was a totally, you cannot predict what can happen 1 minute later. Mostly it happened bad. What you predict, what happened is every time worse than you thought. But as everything is irrational, such a thing that I mentioned can happen.
Brian Schiff, is this what this day is about? Just examining what is human nature?
Well, I think that there is something about that. I mean, I think that there's something about remembering the stories of survivors, trying to recall what the experience was of the camps itself. It definitely is part of it.
It's part of it. What was your reaction when we saw the images earlier, walking through that death camp at Auschwitz, the world leaders that were there, the survivors that came from around the globe?
Well, I think that in our society that we need rituals like this in order to serve as a mechanism for focusing the public on these core issues about what really happened in history. So there's a sense that the ritual of this, of talking, of the images that we're showing right this second, of having the commemoration days, serves as a way of kind of focusing society on this past.
I would say really that the basic task of the Germans, the basic goal of the German was to destroy what one calls human nature for every inmate people. So that's really that you find another people who can take your piece of bread, everything, because human being is built through experience, through childish experience, what he has the confidence of them, as really the goal was to destroy this elementary feeling and this elementary comportment of the people, helping one. When you saw a people who was half dying, when you are sleeping, somebody can take your coverture, everything. So what makes the human being, this is destroyed. This is the basic experiment in the concentration camp and even more in the death camp.
But yet, one of the things that's so fascinating is to look at survivors, now we call survivors, but people who were inmates in the camps. And there's a lot of research that shows, and through personal conversations, that it's not that it didn't affect them. They still live with that experience for the rest of their lives. But there's an extraordinary resilience. People built lives, they had families, they built businesses, and they carried on. So I think that's also part of the story.
And you were at Buchenwald with the Nobel Literature Laureate, Elie
Yes, with Elie Wiesel. I knew him very well. Even we remained very good friends after. And if you ask me who helped me, Elie Wiesel remained that we are in the same block, and he reminded me from time to time, Mijo, you remember that I took care of you, so that you can have an optimistic point of view that even in the hell you will find something. And You spoke, that's true. The resilience is particularly among the children.
So you and Elie Wiesel are at Buchenwald in Germany, in the concentration camp, after he was someone devout. And you said in an interview that you lost faith in the camp.
It took years because I'll tell you, he was of a very religious family, and the family of.
So why did some people become more devout from that experience and others less so?
He didn't develop a more religious. He was revolted against God. But I came from a totally left family, totally most on 4 brothers of my mother. 3 were communist active, 1 even was in Gulag. So we didn't came from the same milieu, let's say, even if after that, for historical reason, I became religious. But basically, Elie Wiesel's culture, even 50 years later, remained a religious culture. So that's my culture. I had a religious, but I became easily secular, coming back
finally to my roots. All right. After the war, you settle in France.
Yeah. Right.
First in an orphanage, and then
with Wiesel.
With Wiesel, right. And before the war, though, you're in Poland, and you're born in Poland in a village in the south of Warsaw, to the slightly to the northeast of Krakow. How does this mark you that the ceremony taking place today on Polish soil?
I think, the experience, first of all of us, what remains in our memory before the war, that among the Polish people, there was a lot of anti-Semites. It was very anti-Semitic, all the children. It was a numerous clausus in the universities of 3% or something.
We're showing here the map of where your village was, Dęblin.
Nice.
You said in an interview that 80% of the village before the war was Jewish?
Right. About 3,000, 4,000 people. There were 500 to 600 Catholic Polish. Otherwise, the older city small city was Jewish. And the most employment place was airport, the military airport, which was there in this city.
Dominik Czosic, what for you is the significance of today's ceremony?
It was for me very touchful. I was born many years after the Second War. I only know version from history, and I also know what tales of my family from Poland. I'm from the mixed family. My father was from Serbia. His mother took part in the partisan movement in Serbia. She was fighting 5 years with German in Serbia against German occupation in Serbia. And my Polish family also was very active fighting with German occupants. So I know many stories from my grandmother, both from Poland and from Serbia. And I remember, if I can say something very personally, I remember what my grandmother, Polish, told me. She was a child when the Second War happened. She was then 11 years old. She was living in a small village close to Warsaw, on the east part of Poland. And when German came to this small village, she told me that it was, of course, horror. It was war. She remembered very well, she had a very small dog, and this dog one day was very noisy, and then she was witness like German soldier just shot this dog. And for a child, it is a shock. But she told me that when Russian came to Poland, after 17th of September, when it was a Russian invasion of Poland, it was absolutely hell. It was hell, because they were worse than animals. They were absolutely barbaric. And comparing with German soldiers, who were regular soldiers, of course they have been sometimes cruel, but they have kind of order. And comparing with them, Russian Soviet soldiers, they have behaved absolutely horrible. and all women, all girls had to hide because it was lots of rapes, lots of damages. So it is for me very personal, what I observed today during this commemoration ceremony, especially that Auschwitz, it is, I think that for all of us, it is very significant that something like this should never happen again, because it was not only about against Jewish people, against Polish, because as you know, Auschwitz was built initially for the Polish people, for the Polish political prisoners. Later it became also for the Jewish people. But it is for all of us memento that we should do everything to avoid for the second time something like Auschwitz.
Brian Schiff, your reaction to Dominika Czosic's story about her family of partisans, on the one side from the former Yugoslavia and the other from Poland itself. Again, collective memory is different according to what background you're from.
Well, I think that we've got, when you talk about collective memory, it's really the memory of the group. And the group that we belong to is kind of, it's instrumentalized in terms of how is it that we see the past. Certainly, Poland is extremely interesting in terms of the way in which Polish people remember the Shoah. And at the same time that there is, Poland had, I believe, the most righteous among the nations awarded by Yad Vashem.
That's the medal we're going to show a report on that in part 2, the medal that's given to those who helped the Jews during World War II.
Yes, but don't forget that there were 3 million Jews in Poland, so it's totally normal.
Yes. So at the same time that you have that, there's also a will on the part of especially the current Polish government to portray that particular aspect of the history of that story, in order to think about Poland as being the savior nation that sheltered Jews during the Holocaust, rather than some of the more controversial pieces of research that have come out within the last 20 years, which talk about complicity.
Just Ezio Rosenman, before we go to the break, you were liberated by the Americans,
by
George
General
Patton's army at Buchenwald in Germany. I read in a report you said you had a sister who was liberated by the Soviets.
Yeah, we are a curious family because all we five, I had 2 sisters, my mother, my father, and me, and everybody from us was liberated in a different part. So me and my father in Buchenwald by General Patton, but my father died 1.5 months later of typhus. My older sister was liberated in Czechoslovakia by the Russian, and my elder sister with my mother were liberated, my sister in Dachau and my mother in Allach. So finally we were all liberated. Even my father knew that we were liberated even if he died. So on several places there are very few Jewish families whose members were all survived, even if it took a month and a half.
That's incredible. When we come back, we're going to talk about what Brian Schiff was talking about, those competing narratives when it comes to what happened. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We're remembering the liberation of Auschwitz 75 years on. We're doing so with Ezio Rosenman, Polish-born Jew who survived the Buchenwald concentration camp, president of the Association for a Humanist and Secular Judaism. Welcome back as well to Brian Schiff, director of the American University of Paris's George and Irina Schaefer Center for the Study of Genocide, Human Rights, and Conflict Prevention. And from Brussels, Dominika Czosic, correspondent for Polish public broadcaster TVP. Yeah, honoring the memory of victims is also honoring those who risked their lives to save Jews. Correspondent Gulliver Cragg sat down with a recipient of Israel's Medal of the Just.
As a child, Helena Troszczynska lived in this house in eastern Warsaw. One evening in 1943, two desperate Jewish cousins showed up here. They'd escaped from the ghetto in the city centre, where the Nazis were crushing the uprising.
My parents gave them a place to spend the night.
In those days, this road was narrow and quiet, with small houses on the other side too. Helena's parents had the keys to one, which had burned down but whose basement was intact.
Isaac Eisenfuss and Jerzy Rudnicki. They stayed there from then on until the liberation of Warsaw in 1944.
Helena, who was 12, would take food and other provisions from her mother across the road for the men. She now lives on the other side of town. After the war, she stayed in touch with Isaac, who nominated her and her mother to be registered as righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem.
Tu jest po hebrajsku, a tu jest po polsku.
Officially, helping Jews in Nazi-occupied Poland carried the death penalty.
We knew what we were risking, but we were brought up with three principles: truth, work, and love thy neighbour. If someone's in need, you have to help them, whether it's a Jew or anyone else.
The Museum of the History of Polish Jews is collecting the stories of the Polish righteous among the nations who are still alive. The project's coordinator says her interviewees all make one point very clearly.
They were afraid of the Germans, but they were mostly afraid of their Polish neighbors. They could get a reward for denouncing them, and also the fact of providing help to the Jews was not appreciated within Polish society. So that's why it was very, very rare to do that and very heroic.
An uncomfortable truth with which Poland is still struggling to come to terms.
Dominika Czosic, your reaction, that museum researcher saying how, well, people were afraid of their neighbors before deciding whether or not to help the Jews.
We should remember what reality was in Poland during German occupation. It was different than in Belgium or France, because in Europe you had only two countries, I mean Poland and former Yugoslavia, in which for helping for Jewish people, you are risking not only your own life, but also life of your family. And it was many examples of Polish people who helped Jewish people to survive, and then someone told that this family helped to Jewish people, and the whole family has been killed. For example, very famous Polish family Ulma, all members of this family, I mean marriage Ulma, Mr. Ulma and Mrs. Ulma, and few of them children, all of them has been killed by Germans because someone thought that they were helping Jewish people to survive. In Poland, people were afraid, of course, of neighbors, but they were afraid of neighbors because they were afraid of German. You see on Polish streets, not only in Warsaw, in Kraków and other cities, public executions. Many people has been killed openly by Germans for helping to Jewish people, for fighting with Germans, for the political activity against German occupation. So I mean that Polish people, citizens of Poland, they were living in permanent afraid. They were living in permanent stress. They knew that every move they are making, that every word they are talking, it can be very risky. They are risking life. So it was not like, like today that we decide that, for example, we help to someone, to some refugees. We are not risking. We are just giving some money or help. During the Second War, Polish people were absolutely risking their own life and life of also their relatives. So that's why this lady told that people were afraid of neighbors. Of course, but neighbors were afraid of other people because it was like permanent terror, permanent stress, permanent terror, because Germans were killing everybody who was helping to Jewish people, because Germans had one plan. They wanted to destroy Jewish nation. So everybody who was obstacle against this plan has been killed.
Isiel Rosenman, what are your memories of this?
Yeah, I don't agree with what the lady told. The truth is from different and more complex, because the lady told about neighbors, and I remember just the book of Jan Gross, whose title is The Neighbors, precisely, and he recounts exactly with a lot of details how in 1941 Polish people, without the help of German, took a few hundred, about 400 Jews, as they closed them and they burned the place. Without the German Nazis were just looking, they don't need. And recently I want also to, there was a symposium in Paris last year here where it was shown by historians of the Polish Academy that a Jew who was hidden, if he hid himself in Poland, has no more than 5% chance to survive, exactly the chance a Jew survived in a concentration camp. Because one shouldn't forget, and there was also heroes. There was in Poland Żegota, a Catholic organization which helped a lot of Jews, who I shouldn't remember, but one cannot wash so easily the historic reality and say that the Polish people was only victim. He was the victim, that's true, but he was also perpetrator.
Dominika Czosic, should President Duda, in the speech he gave at Auschwitz this Monday, have mentioned Żegota, this resistance organization that was specifically dedicated to helping the Jews? Because he didn't mention them by name.
I didn't follow exactly the speech of Polish president, but of course, many thanks to Mr. Roseman that he mentioned Żegota. It was very important movement in Poland. It was really Christian Catholic movement. People who were going to help Jewish friends, Jewish people. And I think that we should remember about Żegota. We should remember on people like Irena Sendler. She was a Polish nurse who, thanks of her, survived many Jewish children. And I think that Żegota is very significant, and as maybe you don't know, one of the Polish former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Władysław Bartoszewski, he died a few years ago. He was also a member of Żegota. He was in Auschwitz. He was German. That's interesting because German allowed him to leave Auschwitz. He was one of only few people who were allowed to leave Auschwitz because of the health condition. And when he left Auschwitz, he became very active in Żegota once again to help Jewish people. And I think that Żegota is a very beautiful example of Polish-Jewish friendship.
Brian Schiff, what's your view on the way the story is being told today?
Well, I think that it's already been said pretty elegantly. I think it's important to talk about the righteous. I think this is definitely a part of the story that needs to be told. But I also think that it's important to tell the stories of the more dark kind of relationships between Polish Catholics and Polish Jews. For instance, one of the things that's very interesting is that many of the ghettos, we remember the Warsaw Ghetto, with its high walls around the ghetto in Warsaw. But many of the ghettos, of which there were hundreds of ghettos, dotted because Jews didn't only live in big cities in Poland, but many of the ghettos had no walls at all. People couldn't escape because they were afraid that they were going to be turned over by their neighbors. And the anti-Semitism that existed kept Jews in their place. So, and the story of Neighbors and Jan Gross is extremely interesting. And it's important. It adds to the complexity of the narrative. As it is right this second, Poland would like to portray itself as being, as Duda said in the quote that you just ran for us, that we were victims and not perpetrators. To only see one side of the story and not the complexity of it.
All right, and last Thursday at the Yad Vashem commemoration in Jerusalem, there was the other side. And again, it has to do with what happened then and rivalries today. A pointed jibe directed at Poland by Russia's president.
We shouldn't forget that this crime had accomplices. Sometimes they even surpassed their masters in their cruelty. It's not just the Nazis who killed people in concentration camps, but also their accomplices in different European countries.
So, is that something that words you can endorse wholeheartedly, or is this an instrumentalization of history when Vladimir Putin speaks?
I think it's right that mainly the main liberation force was the Russian force. Without Stalingrad, the war wouldn't, Germany wouldn't be submitted. That's right. But for our Polish people, I'm not speaking as a Polish, they cannot forget Katyn, they cannot forget the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which allowed really that Russia will invade Poland and divide Poland. That's of the Polish side of the memory. But one shouldn't really forget, I think, that Russia was the main force and the turning point of the war was the Russian army in Stalingrad. That's my opinion.
And when you see the row today between Russia and Poland, what's your view on that?
I think that the conflict has Polish reason because Russia was till 1917, Poland was part of Russia. And Poland is a very, very nationalistic a nation and will maybe speak of all what the nationalism in Europe have destroyed, and that is only, I think, a problem now with the surrender of the nationalism in all the countries of Poland, and still Poland sees the Russian as his main enemy in the memory, in the collective memory. But they see also as there would have been only victims. And that's the trend of the time, because victimhood is much better than heroism.
All around.
That's our time, I think.
Well, it's actually complex, I think, the way in which Poland is trying to portray itself in terms of, you showed the clip with a historian researching the righteous among the nations from the Polin Museum, which is a brand new museum, which is built on the grounds of the Warsaw Ghetto. And, for 40 years, the terrain was almost completely flat with nothing there. And here a new museum is built in order to commemorate it's a collaboration between Jewish groups and the Polish government, but it tells a particular kind of narrative to it which didn't exist before. And the memorial space within Warsaw has been transformed into one that portrays the heroism of individual Poles. Irene Sandler, who was mentioned also in the interview, she's got her own street just outside of the Polin Museum, this space which used to be a grieving ground for Jews.
So there isn't one opinion in Poland, there are several. There's a diversity of views on what happened.
What do you mean?
In terms of what the narrative is, you're saying some people are...
Well, I think that they'd like to portray themselves both as being the victim and the hero.
Dominika Czosic, in this country, in France, I took a documentary that was released by the filmmaker Alain Resnais a decade later, Night in Fog, for the French to begin confronting what had happened in the United States. There was that TV series Holocaust that happened much later. You get the sense that it takes a long time. Are there still people today in Poland coming to grips with what happened?
It depends. Let me just go back to Mr. Roseman told that it is mistake of Poland, not Russia. I'm totally disagree with this, because I think that it is Russia provoking now Poland, because Russia needs now something heroic. You mentioned, Mr. Roseman, that Poland would like now to create a role of heroes and victims. I think that Russia, even much more than Poland, would like to play this role, because Russia is now a very aggressive country. You had example of Georgia in 2008 and Ukraine in 2014. It was examples of Russian aggressive policy against other countries, other neighbors. And now President Putin is pretending to write history once again. He wants us to forget that it was Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, which was the beginning, it was a political beginning of the Second War. As you know, in this pact, they shared Poland into two parts, Polish,
they carved up
German
Poland.
and Russian. And yes, and that's why Russia now wants to say that Russian version of Russia was only one country who wanted to liberate all other countries in Europe. Of course, it was the Red Army who liberated Auschwitz, for example. Of course, we should remember this, and we know this. But from the other side, they didn't do it because they loved the Jewish people, they loved the Polish people, they wanted to liberate. No, it was just political plan of Stalin. It was political agreement between Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill. So it was only part of this. And what now President Putin is talking, it is just horrible, it is shameful, because he won't say that that Poland was guilty and that Poland was aggressor during the Second War. It is absolutely ridiculous. We shouldn't agree with this. And a few weeks ago, even few days ago, during plenary session of the European Parliament in Strasbourg, European Parliament and also European Commission repeated very strongly that it was Russia responsible. It was not Poland, it was not Lithuania responsible, it was Russia, because on the 17th of September, it was Russian invasion of Poland, not Polish invasion of Russia. And Mr. Putin now is creating new version of history. Maybe there's
as to what happened in 1939, 1940. We're running short on time, so I just want to bring up one final point, because we talked about the current context, right? Poland and Russia are at daggers drawn over Ukraine. We heard at the Yad Vashem memorial last week, the Israeli Prime Minister and the U.S. Vice President talking about Iran in the context of remembering Auschwitz. Let's listen to France's president, because at that same ceremony, Emmanuel Macron, who distanced himself, this is, by the way, is the cover of tonight's Le Monde, he said that France is going to start a work on its collective memory when it comes to Algeria, when it comes to Rwanda. And here's what he had to say last Thursday.
There is justice. There is history with its proof. And there is the life of our nations. Let's not confuse them at the risk of collectively relapsing into misfortune. No one has the right to use the memory of the dead to justify some kind of contemporary hatred. We owe everyone who died the truth, the memory, dialogue, and friendship.
So, Izzy Rosenman, there you hear Emmanuel Macron, very lofty, saying, let's separate today's politics from history. But of course, that's impossible, right?
That's totally impossible, because history is part of politics. The use of history is one of the main arms in politics. So I think it's impossible. I would like, as we debate now on what happens, the rise of nationalism in Europe, if I have 2 minutes more, I would like to read a piece of private notes of Stefan Zweig, who was really
A short clip, because we're running short on time. Go
Very
ahead.
short, because it's really actual. He has written this in 1933, just after the rise of Hitler. The European idea is not a primary feeling like the patriotic feeling that of belonging to a people. It does not exist originally from an instinct. It comes from an awareness, far from being the result of spontaneous passion. It is a fruit that has formed slowly around careful thought. First of all, it is completely devoid of passion as instinct, so characteristic of patriotic sentiment, and the man in the street will always better understand the sacred selfishness of nationalism than the sacred altruism of European sentiment, because it is easier to recognize what comes from you than to understand with respect and generosity what comes from the neighbors. And I have 5 more lines. In addition, national sentiment has been structured, that what President told, for centuries, and it can count on the most powerful supporters. Nationalism is so far, it's the school, the army, the newspapers, the uniform, the hymns and the insignia, and the radio and the language. We have to use new means to develop the European sentiment, which is not easy. And he wrote this personally 90 years ago.
And what is the European project is something that we're considering today. Ezio Rosenman, I want to thank you so much. I want to thank Brian Schiff, and I want to thank Dominika Czozic for being with us from Brussels. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to James Creedon.
Hi, Francois. So a big question that is being asked on the 75th anniversary is how to continue to transmit the memory of the Holocaust in a time of changing media landscapes, changing interactions, and all of that. So that has been getting a certain amount of coverage in the media. For example, one particular project, which isn't altogether recent, it was launched sometime last year. This is an Instagram account that was set up by a young Israeli director called Maya Kochavi. And what she did is she serialized the diary of a Hungarian woman called Eva Heyman, who was in Auschwitz. And so it's a sort of a dramatization. You can see there's a YouTube clip kind of summing up what appears on the Instagram story. Basically, she adopts the persona of this Eva Heyman, and she dresses in the costume. She takes kind of selfie-type images. So it's a mixing of the past, the story in the costumes and all of that of the past, but with the codes and the style of how young people communicate today using Instagram and stories and whatnot. Now, it's divided opinion. Some feel that this is a cheapening, a dumbing down of history, that it's not getting the dignity that it should get in terms of the treatment and the form. Others are saying, well, look, this is how young people are consuming information nowadays. They're going to the cinema less often. They're on their devices. This is how you connect them with a story like this. And it's a human account. It's not just information. It's not just statistics. It's connecting them with a narrative. So that it has divided opinion, Francois. You'll remember that social media, Instagram notably, was criticised in the past year because you had visitors going to Auschwitz, perhaps some of them not so aware of the gravity of the place, and sort of just putting themselves front and centre of that visiting experience, to the point where Auschwitz, on their Twitter account, warned people to respect the memory of the place and not to fall into the terrible trap of narcissism that you can have on social media, where people can forget the backdrop.
Let me speak to the psychology professor here. Is this sacrilege?
I think that there's a lot of debate about that. I think that you're right, that young people connect in a different way with information than we do. There's a certain amount of respect that I think needs to be displayed when you enter Auschwitz. But there's even projects. The University of Southern California has a project to create a kind of even a kind of holographic image which can interface. And I've seen it; it works. You can ask a survivor a question, and they respond to that question. It's kind of a complex indexing system, but the argument is that people that are young are going to interact in a different way with these media.
Right, and I guess when we can't have the real accounts as survivors die off, these tools reenacting or having holographic sort of images, it is one way of that, I suppose, the human dimension of the story, the personal accounts can still continue.
All right, many thanks, James Creedon. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.